There is something true about religion that most people, especially most people who aren't very religious themselves, don't expect. In fact, the research paper that inspired this video describes it as a paradox. This is it. Religion seems to demand more of people than a non-religious life. But if more is demanded, why do religious people have higher levels of well-being than non-religious individuals? And if you're saying, whoa, who says religious people have a higher level of well-being? Just hang on, we'll get there. But before diving in, I just want to acknowledge that I am not a psychologist. So I'm going to just stick to the studies themselves that are by psychologists and give lots of citations so you can look these things up in more detail if you're interested. And then I will wrap it all up with two of my own thoughts at the end. The core of what we'll be talking about today comes from a psychology paper called Why Religious Burdens Are Light: From Religiosity to Self-Regulation. And I am going to let that paper lay out this apparent paradox in its own words. Maintaining religious standards often means that individuals must endure considerable discomfort and forsake many pleasurable experiences. Accordingly, one might expect religious individuals to display lower emotional well-being than non-religious individuals. However, if anything, empirical evidence suggests the opposite. Religious individuals generally display fewer ruminative thoughts. Rumination, by the way, is dwelling on negative feelings, and it contributes to depression and anxiety. So religious individuals generally display fewer ruminative thoughts, lower levels of inner conflict, and higher levels of positive emotion compared to non-religious individuals. The psychological profile of religious individuals is thus something of a paradox. Indeed, how do religious individuals manage to stay calm and content while they are struggling to meet the high standards of their religion? The authors of this paper aren't alone in assessing religious individuals as having a higher level of well-being. Martin Seligman, one of the founders of positive psychology, says, "A sizable body of research has demonstrated a positive link between religiosity, in particular religious involvement, and psychological and physical well-being." And the Handbook of Religion and Health, which surveys all of the research done on the subject, found that out of more than 300 studies, 78% report a positive association between religiosity and well-being. Quick disclaimer here. Most of the studies refer to religious people. Why Religious Burdens Are Light does say that the available evidence is largely based on Christian and Western samples, but they weren't trying to study one religion compared to another, but religious people compared to non-religious people. I am also going to refer to study participants as religious people throughout this video, but I'm not trying to make any kind of theological statement by that. I'm just borrowing the language of the study because, again, I'm not a psychologist and I don't want to go freestyling here. So I had two really big takeaways. I think I mentioned that already from this study in particular, and I'll get to those below. But first, since this article makes the case that self-regulation is the reason for this greater well-being, I'm going to take 90 seconds, maybe 120, to explain what self-regulation is. Then we'll talk about some specific differences that turn up in religious people. There are a lot of things that require self-regulation. So this is a list from an article called The Strength Model of Self-Control. These are things that require self-regulation: controlling your thoughts, managing your emotions, overcoming unwanted impulses, for example, not eating cake because you're on a diet, paying close attention to something, guiding your behavior, and making choices. When you start to run out of the ability to self-regulate, you might be more likely to overspend, overeat, be quick to anger, have trouble controlling sexual impulses, have difficulty with decision-making. But the article isn't just making the case that religious people are better at self-regulating. It's actually making the case that religiosity, in part, helps develop a different kind of self-regulation from what at least I commonly think about. Essentially, there is self-regulation that is clearly defined. This is known as explicit self-regulation. It's the kind of self-control that says, I'm going to set a goal, I'm going to make a to-do list, I'm going to start checking things off. Then there is implicit self-regulation, which is more holistic. It's something that happens intuitively rather than analytically. You do something not because it's on a to-do list, but because it lines up with who you believe yourself to be. This is the way the article describes it. Religiosity may promote the acquisition of skills that are conducive to implicit self-regulation. In addition, engaging in religious practices or exposure to religious stimuli may activate cognitive procedures, motivational and emotional states, and other psychological mechanisms that increase people's readiness to engage in implicit self-regulation. Okay. Now that we have the context of what psychologists think is happening or think explain this higher level of well-being, what are the ways that religious people differ from their non-religious peers? There were a lot of studies referenced in the article. To quote the article itself, the link between religion and implicit self-regulation was confirmed in more than 30 independent experiments. And that's just counting the ones mentioned in this particular article. I am only going to talk about a fraction of them, and even those I'm not really going to do justice to. A lot of them warrant a video all of their own, which is something that I'm thinking about for the future. So if you're interested, you can subscribe and chime in the comments about any of that you'd like to hear more about in the future. First of all, implicit self-regulation changes the way people act. To quote the article, 2 studies found that when participants were first primed with God-related concepts, priming, by the way, is basically exposing a participant to a word, image, or action in a way they aren't conscious of to see how it affects their behavior. So when participants were primed with God-related concepts such as spirit, divine, and God in an unrelated task, they behaved more generously in a standardized social interaction task than did unprimed participants. Related studies have found that priming religious contents increases pro-social behaviors such as honesty and volunteering to help a charity. This shouldn't come as a surprise because the same thing happens in the real world. In his book, American Grace, the sociologist Robert Putnam says religious Americans are, in fact, more generous neighbors and more conscientious citizens than their secular counterparts. Religion boosts total volunteering so substantially that in addition to their higher rate of religious volunteering, regular churchgoers are also much more likely to volunteer for secular causes. Or, to put it another way, if you take volunteering of religious Americans and compare it to the volunteering of secular Americans, and then you subtract every single hour that religious Americans spend volunteering at churches or faith-based organizations, they still volunteer more time than their secular counterparts. Another interesting way that the behavior of religious people differs is that they are more future-looking, less driven by short-term gratification. And if your reaction is, so what? Delayed gratification is a significant predictor of well-being. The people who rate worst at delayed gratification tend to be drug addicts. This is a quote from the psychologist Roy Baumeister in his book on willpower. It's by Baumeister and John Tierney. The typical person that they studied contemplated the future over 4.5 years ahead, while the typical addict's vision of the future extended only 9 days. Impulses toward immediate gratification can lead people to discount future rewards. Studies found that religious individuals displayed less discounting of future rewards. Notably, the effects of religiosity on temporal discounting were enhanced after religious individuals had engaged in a prayer exercise. And participants in the study didn't know there was a connection between the prayer exercise and the temporal discounting measure. They thought they were unrelated activities. Religion doesn't just affect actions, it changes the way people feel too. For example, different studies have shown that after being provoked, praying for the person reduces the feelings of anger, while just being told to think about the person didn't make a difference, which will probably not surprise anyone who has ever actually taken Jesus' directive seriously to pray for your enemies. It is very difficult to hate somebody who you are praying for. So religious people seem to benefit from implicit self-regulation in their actions and in their feelings, but the third category covered by this study is a person's sense of meaning and purpose. But rather than talk about any one study cited in the article, I'm going to go back to the Handbook of Religion and Health again, to the fact that out of 45 total studies on the relationship between religiosity and a person's sense of purpose and meaning, 93% of those studies show that religious people have a greater sense of meaning and purpose, which I think is incredibly significant when many people today are experiencing a crisis of meaninglessness in their lives and a nagging sense of purposelessness. And like I said, that's just a fraction of the studies. They also talk about the reduced perception of pain, increased positivity after prayer, and being less sensitive to temptation and more. So this is my first big takeaway from all of the above. In an age when I hear people asking, has Christianity made the world a better or worse place? Part of the conversation should be that it makes people less angry, less anxious, more generous, more honest, more patient, and less controlled by their emotions. And as the study says, the ability to regulate one's actions and emotions and the ability to construct meaningful existence are foundational to psychological health. For me as a believer, it's encouraging to have science support what I have personally experienced both in myself and in other people who are genuinely committed to faith. And I think it's something that should be taken into consideration by people asking whether or not Christianity has made the world a better place. The second thing I find noteworthy about this is the way in which this article says this change is experienced. Certainly, there are explicit ways that a person will work to change their behavior if they come to a sincere religious belief. But this article is proposing that in addition to those clear, intentional changes, there's also an inward change so that religious people, at least in the population studied, aren't crushed by the weight of these higher standards. There is something that has changed within them that drives their behavior in a holistic way. The article title itself obviously quotes Jesus in the gospel according to Matthew when he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." But it also reminds me of the gospel according to John. Jesus teaches his disciples in John 15 saying, "I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I remain in you, you will bear much fruit." And that seems to be exactly what these psychologists are proposing. When people come to faith, they begin to bear fruit. And speaking of fruit, it reminds me of Paul's famous passage on the fruit of the Spirit in his letter to the Galatians. He says that people who live according to the Spirit will grow in love and joy and peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I think I ended up with 9 fingers there, but I thought there were only 8. Anyhow, as I look at this list of research cited in this article, and honestly, a huge body of research beyond it, I am struck by how it reflects what Paul tells us will happen inside of believers from the inside out. Praying for your enemies will increase your love and patience. And speaking of patience and self-control for that matter, we see both of these in religious people being more willing to have delayed gratification. And I don't know where exactly to put things like donations, honesty, and volunteering, but it seems like we've got plenty of options in the fruit of the Spirit for looking for ways that those line up. And now I have a secret. I don't know how to end videos. I always get to this point and I just don't know how to land the plane. I guess to recap, religion seems to get a lot of bad press, but the science says that it actually leads to greater well-being. And it seems to do it in a way that Jesus and the Apostle Paul told us to expect 2,000 years ago. And then one of my favorite lines from the article's conclusion, perhaps the most important notion that derives from the present work, is that some seemingly illogical aspects of religion, such as beliefs in the supernatural, beliefs in mystical experiences, and attaching sacred meanings to mundane events, may in fact contribute to what is psychologically beneficial about religion. I just genuinely find it very amusing that this article operates on the assumption that religion is completely, bafflingly illogical. But for some reason, it just seems to work. If you found this interesting, consider liking and subscribing. I'm trying to be more consistent and post once a month. And man, if you've got advice for how I can do a better job wrapping up a video, lay it on me, because at the moment, I feel like I just end up flopping around like a fish when it comes to the end.